Exactly. So, wir starten. Sehr gut, das Licht geht auch aus. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen im Museum 5 Kontinente. Mein Name ist Anahita Mittertreiner. Ich bin hier am Haus Kuratorin für die Abteilung Südwestasien und Nordafrika. Und es ist mir eine sehr, sehr große Freude, Sie heute zu einem Vortrag von Wendy zu empfangen, einer der international führenden Expertinnen für die Schnittstelle von Kunst, Philosophie, Religion und postkolonialer Theorie im islamischen Raum. Wendy wurde 1999 an der UCLA promoviert und war als Professorin in den Bereichen Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, Media Studies und Kunstgeschichte in den USA, der Türkei, der Schweiz und in Deutschland tätig. Und nach ihrer Professur für islamische Kunst an der FU Berlin, die 2021 endete, ist Wendy nun befreit von den disziplinären Vorgaben universitärer Strukturen und erforscht weiterhin die Schnittstellen von Kultur und Religion, nicht nur wissenschaftlich, sondern auch durch Poesie, wie wir heute vielleicht sehen werden, Fiktion, Collage und Keramik, wie ich vorher erfahren habe. Zu ihren vielseitigen Werken und auch viel beachteten Werken zählen Possessors and Possessed, Museums, Archaeology and the Visualization of History in the Late Ottoman Empire, noch Ottoman Painting, Reflections of Western Art from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, sowie das preisgekrönte What is Islamic Art? Between Religion and Perception. Ein Buch, das noch auf meiner Liste steht und das ich heute, glaube ich, noch in meinen Warenkorb reinlegen werde, ist Loving Writing, Techniques for the University and Beyond. Und da bin ich besonders gespannt auf die Lektüre. Wer sich mit Wendy Werk beschäftigt hat, dem oder der ist vielleicht aufgefallen, dass die Story eine große Rolle im Werk spielt. Und dazu kann ich jetzt auch schon persönlich beitragen. Innerhalb der ersten 5 Minuten, wir haben uns heute kennengelernt, wurde ich nach meiner Story gefragt. Und das hat mich auch sehr gefreut, denn das ist ein Ansatz, den ich persönlich sehr schätze und den ich für einen sehr vielversprechenden halte. Und deswegen möchte ich jetzt zum Abschluss dieser Einleitung auch noch eine kleine Story teilen und erzählen. Denn neulich, also als Aufgaben als Kuratorin, gehört auch dazu, dass man Führungen durch die Ausstellungen gibt. Und neulich habe ich eine Führung gegeben zu einem Thema in der Ausstellung. Wir sind rumgelaufen. Ich habe über Musik gesprochen und über das Wahrnehmen von Musik. Und plötzlich meinte einer der Besuchenden, dass er neulich in einem ganz interessanten Buch gelesen hätte von Wendy ob ich schon mal davon gehört hätte, wie wichtig auch die sinnlichen Eindrücke sind. Und natürlich, alle Leute in unserem Fach haben dieses Buch, glaube ich, gelesen und verschlungen. Und ob er denn Kollege sei. Und er meinte, nein, er hätte das im Buchladen gesehen, der Titel hat ihn angesprochen und dieses Buch hat ihn zu uns in die Ausstellung geführt. Also vielen Dank, Wendy, für diesen Besucher. Das war wirklich ein total schöner Moment, weil das auch zeigt, wie viel Einfluss du nicht nur auf die Szene selber, auf unsere Bubble, sondern eben auch nach außen ausstrahlst. Vielen Dank. Und wenn ich Sie jetzt neugierig gemacht habe mit dieser kurzen Einleitung, dann funktioniert das Chance-Prinzip auch bei Ihnen. Und nun bitte ich Sie, mit mir gemeinsam Professor Wendy zu begrüßen.
Thank you. That was one of the kindest and sweetest introductions I've ever heard. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you all for coming. So let's see how this goes. You'll notice the title changed a little bit, but same. Nothing is new in the murder of idols. Breaking them was long excused as righteously guided. The idols broken in Judaic antiquity justified those destroyed under Christianity. Such European concerns might be traced to the golden calf ordered to be effaced. The danger of worshipping the wrong God might be applied to the worship of any at all. Who is to know which God will stand tall if choosing between them is just a powerful free-for-all? While such destruction has long been traced to the so-called iconoclasm of Eastern Roman rule, where iconoclasts ridiculed saints like John for devising images eyes might prey upon. Under Europe's supposed beneficence, the absence of Jewish artistic significance was explained not by oppression, but as a consequence of lamentation. Because their eyes are sick, their hearts are sick, their eyes have grown dim. Thus the Christian martyr Justin explained Leah, she was the synagogue, Rachel the church. Where her eyes were weak, ours became strong. And this, they said, had consequence in Synagogia's blind obedience. Although today worship through images is less pernicious, accusations with repetitive insistence do persist of Islam's supposed ignorant fanatical image prohibition. Abraham's iconoclasm, as depicted in Islamic manuscripts, can be purposefully misread to prove terroristic Islamic rules, so that free-speaking porkers can freely taunt pre-modern fools. You would think Europe with pictures was always cool, but no one can beat European disputations that led to frenzies of their own idol breakings. In Zwinglian and Calvinist abandon were idols destroyed. Soon after Wittenberg became iconoclastic, Luther said, "No need to be so bombastic. I believe that there is no person, or certainly very few, who does not understand that the crucifix itself is not my God." Through Luther's words, the inner eye must be by the outer be absorbed. Nonetheless, pious eyes worried. "Although I know imagery's incapabilities," Bodenstein complained, "I worry. The devil's fools might offend me. I fear I fail to burn my idols. From shadows do I flee." Iconoclasm, transformed through enlightened reason, transmogrified to the pillaging of churches and palaces in a later season. Oops. I'm trying to get this to move. And vigor that once defaced images, now adored them, madly hoarding at first at home, and then far abroad. What's mine is yours was never said. Instead, what's yours is now mine, alive or dead. With new meanings, I will fill my halls. Oops. What the hell? Having a little bit technical problems here. There we go. With new meanings, I will fill my halls. Skeletons fleshed from mystery to history. To new idols, they built heady temples, filled with art of every land, pillaged, crumpled, rebuilt, restored, and in glass cased. When you see heads of the Buddha arrayed, like the Virgin Mary enthroned as though on an invisible tree, remember she was exhumed when a secular association, centuries later, dismissed cares of idolatrous adoration. And the Buddha heads were chopped off statues sitting, beheaded, while their meditating acolytes lay with red blood still dripping. As capitalism grew, worth to objects did accrue. Museums became temples of mass accumulation, housing of inviolable idols to measure market circulation. Perfect cases denatured every item, from the spaces and the words and the notes and the chords and the poems, and all life that once danced about them. Reduction to art, patronage, and history reduces pilgrimage to the external sense of sight in the fortress of consciousness. Where painting might use visual realism to make the direction of prayer a vehicle of derision, the museum display transforms the prayer niche into a flat, shiny surface of illegible foreignness. Which is better, comic illustration or absent explanation? With little language to communicate what we see, we build rather than break walls between the you and the me. Thus, when after terrorist explosions dubbed as 9/11, the Metropolitan Museum, its galleries revamped with a new regionalist de-Islamic slant, reviewer Peter Shedhal could say without irony, "The Islamic wing affords adventures indifference. It made me acutely conscious of myself as a European American, a latter-day scion of the Renaissance wedding of Greek and Roman with Judeo-Christian traditions. It did this by reversing my sense of Islam as a topic of study. Rather abruptly, Islam seemed to be scrutinizing me." Such sacrifice to Euro-America is hardly unique. Each land sells poetry's charm for the nation's physique. No innocent art is this, pristine in its glass coffin, more like Snow White fainted from collection's poison. Like bones in Catholic shrines bejeweled, saintly incorruptibility to prove, the object encased must not, by destruction, be disgraced. Funny thing is, its placement there for perpetuation depends on the death of meaning's circulation. Like the glass sarcophagus, the museum's glass box sells life's precarious dexterity for death's definitive clarity. Meaning emerges not through engagement, but through the boundary of estrangement. When no oil burns within, do lamps shine? In darkness, how can we discover the divine? Jalaluddin Rumi suggests, form is brought into existence by the formless, just as smoke is produced by a fire. Formlessness throws you into absolute bewilderment. From non-instrumentality, 100 kinds of instruments are born. Theodor Adorno toots a similar horn. The German word Museal has unpleasant overtones. It describes objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship and which are in the process of dying. Museums are like the family sepulchres of works of art. They testify to the neutralization of culture. Once tradition is no longer animated by a comprehensive, substantial force, but has to be conjured up by means of citations, because it's important to have tradition, then whatever happens to be left of it is dissolved into a means to an end. That the world is out of joint is shown everywhere in the fact that however a problem is solved, the solution is false. Surrounded by our ancestors' hordes, caught between admiration and horror, how can we learn of stolen objects attain when the logic of collecting and owning erases the lives lost in the gleaning while perpetuating the erasure of meaning? I've lost my arrow. Oh, there it is. No? Sorry. This is very different on the Mac. Weirdly. Okay, here we go. Power to the poetry, I say. For through words we learn how meaning might scream between the coffin of commodification and the idol's institutional tomb. Especially in our era of dehumanizing spread, when politicians defund humanities as dead, when artificial intelligence invents information, and genocidal violence slaughters babies as pigs. Poetry is that which cannot be taken away. Art survives whatever they say. This is why poetry frightens power, a subtle indication of needing to disobey. As Mahmoud Darwish reminds us, tyrants fear song. Academics, about the undying supremacy of plain exposition, might sometimes simply be wrong. Sometimes we need literal definitions, but sometimes I think we understand better through song. Let's sit then at the foot of objects collected. Let us listen to the stories they heard and consider what other wine might there be, fit for us to drink unbound from a less sepulchral category. With a wise story from Sheikh Jalal ad-Din Rumi we begin, learned from his beloved master, the son of Tabriz. For the first lesson here is that poetry rises from seeds planted between the verses of the yous and the me's. There was a king, begins Rumi. Let us pause to gaze upon him. Of him, portraits there can be none. Which king is he? Does it matter? He is the smattering of all kings imprinted in the composite sense, the mind's eye, a trope of our imagination, refined by repeated infiltration of paintings and picture books galore, that long ago washed from shore to shore. He sits not upon a gilded throne, but upon a pillow quite alone. No scepter or sword in hand, sometimes a cup perhaps of wine. His regal guise, neither war nor glory, but from margins adorning fable and poetry. With such defense, our wisdom from Mevlana will commence. The king he mentioned had 3 sons, each sage and discerning, each more praiseworthy than the next in generosity, and in battle and in exercising royal sway. The princes, the delight of the king's eye, stood together like 3 candles before him, and the father's palm tree drew water by a hidden channel from the 2 fountain eyes of each son. They set out to visit their father's distant possessions and to tour his cities and fortresses to regulate the administrative and economic conditions. They bade him farewell. Then the king, by all obeyed, said to them, "Direct your course wherever your heart may lead. Go under the protection of God. Dance joyously. Go anywhere except one fortress, the name of which is the robber of reason. It scrambles the signals for wearers of the crown. For God's sake, keep far away from that castle adorned with pictures and beware of the peril. The front and back of its towers and its roof and floor are all covered with images and decorations and pictures." He compares it like the chamber of Zulaykha, which she made full of pictures in order that Joseph should look upon her with lust. Since Joseph would not look at her, she cunningly filled the room with portraits of herself, so that wherever the fair-cheeked youth looked, he might see her face without having the power to choose. 2 centuries later, the poet Jalal told a far longer story. Everywhere in this hall, the image maker brought a semblance of Joseph with a painting of Zulaykha, together seated as beloved and lover. In love of souls and hearts' embrace, here he kissed her lip, there she loosened her sash. Should a glance from any other artist but thereupon glide, envy's water from his own mouth should flow. Here we have the idea of a museum, its walls built from poetry's words, images galore in every hall to rob us of our senses, all as lover robs beloved, and beloved at the feet of lover falls. Such magical galleries long inhabited, books of Islamic mysteries hidden in romances. The 12th century poet of Nishapur, Farid ad-Din Attar, lets us know. The mystical bird called the simurg, described in Ferdowsi's 10th century Book of Kings, and according to Suhrawardi, also reflecting divine means, was the source of worldly galleries. Ah, the simurg, what a miracle! Once did she grant us a glimpse of her secret, once in a far-off land. A feather fell from her, floating through the sky. Turmoil took the country, every nook, every woman, every man, every child, every kitten, every crook, every being driven by desire, fought for an image of that feather, jostling like customers at a Black Friday sale. Whoever beheld the image reached far beyond its pale. Today this feather sits in the picture gallery of that far-off land. Seek knowledge, be it even from China. The prophet invited us to understand. If the image of her feather had not disclosed itself, all the world would shudder blind without its truth. All these works of creation exist through her radiance, all images born from the image of her feather. But since her description begins without beginning and ends without end, all further speech of her floats quietly out the door and around the bend. Compare this introduction to the type favored in modern education. After the Mongol conquest of Persia in the 13th century, an extensive trade network opened from China to the Mediterranean, allowing goods to move more freely than in prior centuries. As the objects in this case demonstrate, Ilkhanid period artists readily adopted imagery from Chinese iconography, including lotus flowers, deer, dragons, and other mythical creatures. This image of a soaring phoenix with crested head and elaborate trailing plumage exemplifies the adaptation of Chinese imagery by Persian artists. Would a person who saw this tile on the wall have thought any of this? What do we learn about Islamic or Ilkhanid or Chinese culture from this information? What are the kinds of ideas we're invited to think about? Location, history, trade, influence, cultural exchange. And what are these myths that this explanation doesn't tell us? What does it mean to learn terms of trade and economy, cultural exchange, and a visual lexicography, without considering the divine dimension which long informed sensory appreciation? What values do we put on display when meaning hovers in history and value lingers only in economy? While ethics and religion are relegated to categories no different from nation, exchangeable, fungible, and of intrinsic meaning bereft. What became of those three princes? Rumi recounts. When he, the king, uttered prohibition, a craving arose in their hearts to investigate its secrets. Turning their backs on the bright day, the princes came in the dark night, in defiance of counsel bestowing reason, into the beautiful fortress adorned with pictures, which had 5 gates to the sea and 5 to the land. 5 of those gates, like the external senses, facing towards color and perfume, the material world. 5 of them, like the interior senses, seeking the world of mystery. By those thousands of pictures and designs and decorations, the princes wandered in awe. Is such awe and magic not exactly what is ritually enacted whenever we pass the museum door and moving floor to floor Honor the artists who made things, as well as the collectors and donors who gave things, and above all, the nations who inspired them. Thus are we invited to transform one mode of admiration for the next, recognizing that the camel of creation, with a multitude of frames and many overlapping burdens, is blessed. The revelation of image from image, genre from genre, is rarely confessed. Rumi jumps in to set us all straight. He says, "Do not be intoxicated with these cups, lest thou become a carver of idols, an idolater. Abandon the cups, namely the forms, do not tarry. There is wine in the cup, but it's not from the cup. Open your mouth wide to the giver of the wine. When the wine comes, the cup will not be lacking." The castle is perhaps not unlike the castle in the story of Sleeping Beauty, where suitors vie to enter the castle of sleepers, where the princess and her attendants await the theophanic kiss, the ideal love that resurrects. But like that story, this too is a love story. What else are pictures in galleries for? The three princes espied a beauteous and majestic portrait. The travelers had seen pictures more beautiful than that, but at the sight of this one, they were plunged in the deep sea. After much inquiry during their travel, a sheikh endowed with insight disclosed the mystery. Not verbally, by way of the ear, but silently, by inspiration derived from reason. To him, all mysteries were unveiled. He said, "This is the portrait of the girl envied by no less than the Pleiades. This is the picture of the Princess of China." Their love for the picture resembles the future the poet Nizami of Ganj inspired for the king Bahram Gur, when in the palace of his education he enjoyed a chamber of idols representing his 7 future brides, each a planet and a color, and a conveyor of stories that would make him wise. Let's imagine him, a young man, brawny, with sport, tipsy, looking upon images of wonder, images of ladies, falling into dreams. This, too, is part of what we associate with museums. Let us return to that princess of China. She is hidden like the spirit and like the embryo. She resides in a secret bower and palace. Neither man nor woman enters her presence. The king has concealed her on account of her fascinations. The king jealously protects her honor so that not even a bird flies above her roof. Even the Simurgh, we might wonder? But the Simurgh, too, is an utter mystery. Rumi explains, because opium came to them in this cup, the cups are visible, but the opium is unseen. The fortress, named the destroyer of reason, did its work. It cast them all three into the pit of tribulation. Without a bow, the glances of love, like arrows, pierce the heart. Mercy, mercy, O merciless one. Adoration of a stone image consumed past generations and kindled fire in their hearts. When the image is spiritual, how it does ravish. At every moment, its kaleidoscope is savage. Since love of the pictured form stabbed like a spear each prince's heart, each shed tears like rain from cloud, each gnawed his hands and cried, "Oh, alas! Now we see why our father the king warned us." Notice the illustrative convention of romance, where the beloved stands in the direction of prayer, making romantic love the allegory of transcendence. The lover tempts us through the palace of the world, where love points us towards God, as depicted by Bisad, made famous by art history, because the signing of his name became future glory. Watch how the lady Zuleika, smitten with Joseph's divine glow, chases him through the palace of seduction designed by the master architect of all, who sparkles beyond introduction. Joseph glows right above the empty niche of the mihrab. The direction of God is not the idol or beloved, but the eternal beyond representation. How is the visitor in the museum to encounter form, not as images with inscriptions, but as this yearning for completion, beyond worldly ambitions? With a welter of beautiful metaphors and flourishes and interruptions and parables, long story short, the first brother dies of annihilation in longing for the beloved. The second brother dies of conceit born of understanding, shot through the heart by the arrow of the king who loves him. Rumi, near the end of the manuscript cut short by the end of his life, tells us no more than this of the third brother. He was the laziest of the three. He won the prize completely, the form, appearance, as well as the reality. How can we understand this? The lazy one gets the prize. Why? Modernity teaches the virtue of industry. What glory in laziness might lie? The Mughal Shah Abbas once is said to have said, "I have searched so long in the path of form that I have changed my way from the form to the meaning." We gain not by freezing and owning, but by flowing, considering, and continually growing. Waiting for this to go. When the feather fell from far away in distant China, everybody scrambled to acquire its image. The picture galleries filled with its images. All images are this image of a bird forever unseen. Having technical difficulties. Giving it a second. Museums fill with feathers, with the failure of language to show what the image tells. Art history misses its mark. Words miss their mark. Images show, but never tell. It's coming. Sure, it's coming. It'll come. I clicked. It will come. Like that lazy brother, it's being the lazy brother. Like that lazy brother whose ambivalence wins him the hand of the Princess of China, the path to exhibition lies neither in annihilation nor in adulation. By grasping, we destroy the object of our adoration. By giving it away, we retreat to the dull mirror of self-adulation. Here is no Kantian disinterest modeled through empiricism, nor does poetry spill feelings in an emotive abyss, nor does art provide inspiration for industrial competition. It insists on no ideological transcendence to veil the material forces of ownership, colony, and capital. We begin with awe, not a category or argument, to escort the lover on a walk of wonder, sliding through associations along a vine of flowers, moving between nodes of poetry's powers, removing reason's blindfold, allowing us to see, inspiring play between reason and intuition, the quilting of stories, sometimes as brambles, sometimes as vines, disjointed, nonlinear, overlapping, temporary, surprising. We touch no bodies until text enables vision. We drink from no cups without knowing wine. We need some kind of lazy love to wax divine.
Thank you so much. I think I've never heard. Yes. This was quite amazing. I was prepared to note many questions, but as you see, I was so mesmerized. I couldn't even think about something else, because it's if you hear knowledge in poetry, it makes something. You really digest it completely differently than if you would have given an ordinary talk, as like all the other talks I've heard so far. So I loved it. I have to recollect
Wow,
myself.
thank you. That's because this is an experiment for me. This is, we were talking earlier, and I told Anahita that my third book really changed me. And one of the things it changed in me was when I got to the end and I said, I don't want to learn about, I want to learn from. And the meaning of what it means to learn from has expanded over time, because I keep discovering new ways of learning from. And, other people, of course, learn from in other ways, right? That's an open field. But, how does one... one of the things I tried to do was think about what is the boundary I place between the artist and the poet and myself as somebody who's analyzing. And I've always had weird issues with that, with art, because I make art. So that's always been a weird thing of like, you put the artist here and here at the same time. And then I was thinking we do the same thing with poets. And why aren't we learning from the poets? Why are they speaking in poetry? What does that do? Because it does something. And, why as academics are we like, well, it's not proper, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's not scholarly. And, what is this value of the scholarly? It's not incomprehensible. And then when I said to my daughter, who's 17, I'm doing the talk in poetry, she was like, is it going to be understandable? And I was like, are long sentences with lots of examples understandable? Are academic articles understandable? I was like, yes, yeah. But, so I'm glad if the experiment worked, and thank you all for, being here for it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm very happy that we have it recorded and I could just go back and listen to it again to grasp every inch of it, because maybe some things were missed. But I think it's a very interesting approach, and it made me think a lot. I mean, being a museum person and looking, you showed pictures of exactly this exhibition. Everything is behind a glass coffin, and that's just how it is. The showcase is in glass, and you look at the object, and the object is behind the glass. You cannot touch it, you cannot smell it, you cannot engage with it,
to me,
besides looking.
The other thing of it is that, I'm sorry if I interrupted you,
No.
but, or I did interrupt you, but sorry. Yeah. Anyway, but the thing is that what really bothers me is that if we go to a museum of, say, medieval art, we know what a crucifixion is going in. And so we can fill in a lot of the details. But when somebody sees like a pot with writing that they can't read, they don't know what that is. If somebody sees a mihrab in a museum, I asked my students once, how do people use this object? They had no idea. And if the museum isn't giving them that information of what people do, and it's saying it's ceramic, it was made in Kashan, it was made in this year, and so on. My students are like, it's shiny, it's big. They don't have, you literally don't have the words to fill that in. So the other thing that's like a pet peeve is if you look at a lot of these paintings, they'll tell you, not these, sorry. These I actually did for my book talk because I was so scared of doing a book talk about this book that I made a huge animation for it.
Procrastinating.
But yeah, if you don't know these stories, What are you going to understand from this? From either the modern one or the historic one. And they'll say, it's a Sheikh Sanan beneath the window of the Christian maiden from the Mantiq al-Tayr. Like, that's the information you have. Or it'll say, Layla and Majnun, and they were star-crossed lovers. It's like, you have a whole poem there for a reason. It's not a summary, it's a whole poem. And I have many pet peeves like this. But yeah. But I feel like there's so much information one can have that doesn't involve necessarily the senses, but involves that sense.
Yeah. And when you say, I open it in a moment, I'm sorry, I have so many questions now if I think about the talk. When you say it's not a cup, it's the wine. But in a museum you only have the cups. So we went through the exhibition. What would be your if you would come here?
I have it easy because I'm the critic.
Exactly.
And it's so much harder to actually be the curator, like so much harder. But I think when I think of this quote, it's something about the container and the contained. And for me, this isn't about what we're looking at, but it's a lot about how much we're focusing on the form of each object. And I think it is important to have a proper, this is from this time, this place, the materials are from here or there. But we're not providing other information about, say, how cups would be used in social situations. We don't have information about all the poetry. For example, one could talk about, say, these kinds of cups with Islam forbids wine, and there is lots of wine, and there is lots of wine imagery. How can we talk about this? I think for me, the more important thing is that we're focusing so much on the objects and the specificity of the objects, we're not including the formlessness. And it's the formlessness that constructs the form. That is, both when I'm reading this quote and when I'm reading the other quote I had about formlessness, the other quote was, I think it's before this. I don't remember the exact order I have things in. It was the one with, I think it's before this still. But it's the smoke that creates the form. It's like backwards. I can't find it that easily.
It's almost like form follows function.
It's the opposite. It's that function follows formlessness. And that's, I find, really interesting. So I guess my answer would be to have generally far fewer objects and provide ways of, was it behind this? No.
Sorry. Was the exhibition.
I'll just stick with this one and then, because here at least we have one of them. To have fewer objects, but to provide ways of thinking about those objects. So say we were looking at some of the bowls where there's an issue of drinking, right, and drinking the sacred, and then thinking about the idea of taking something in. So then you could talk about that, how people wash off a board on which the Quran's inscribed. One could talk about the drinking bowl. One might be able to use, animations. One might have poetry about this. That is, there's a tendency to reduce text and include the visual imagery. To my mind, that works if people already know what they're seeing. But to me, one needs to have a lot more information to know what you're seeing. Otherwise, you're like, they wrote things on the clavicle bone of a cow. Why am I looking at a cow bone? And yet that's an amazing object to still have, right? And I saw it and I was like, wow, you actually have the bone. That's so cool. And yet it's also a 20th century object. It's not so historically valuable. So for me, the ideal would be to really think about what constitutes value. How did the collectors consider value in a way that's distinct from the ways in which things functioned in the world? It's a hard question, right? And I think maybe when we were talking, you mentioned that every exhibit feels obliged to tell the same story. And I think that sort of paradigmatic story of this is Islam, this is Islamic art, it doesn't have anything to do with how people would have interacted with these objects in some sort of reality. So for me, as I've been doing a lot of work in which I'm writing fiction, and I'm basing it in information. And even when I was doing historical writing, I was like, oh God, working from documents is like going to a table 100 years after people ate and finding some of the crumbs of what they ate and trying to figure out what they were talking about. You know, it's like so far removed. And so what I've been doing is I'm taking information that sort of is semi-fixed and then thinking about how might that have happened. So the first time I did this in a long form was, there are very famous photographs by Friedrich Zara when he went to Bukhara. And there's one in which there's a storyteller in front of a mosque, and it's a little bit of a blurry photograph, which makes it really nice, because the storyteller is very active. And I was like, did Friedrich Zara understand the story? Probably not. So we don't have language. Then I was like, why was he even in Bukhara? Like, I get his going to Tehran, but how did he get to Bukhara? And so by asking this question, how could he have gotten to Bukhara? I didn't know anything about it. I came up with the first petrol ships were running from, I believe, Baku to where the new Transcaucasian Railway was going. And Russia was at that time busy conquering Central Asia and transforming their silk production into cotton production because the US Civil War had just happened. And Friedrich Zara was in Bukhara because that train was new. Right? So I got to these things I never would have gotten to through Islamic art. Because when those things became Islamic art, the things he collected, they are metalwork from such and such a century and such a location. You know, and so I think that for me the thing is not to know what you're getting, but to let the form produce the cup. That is, to let the information sort of come to produce the thing that's containing it, but not to go with the category or with the history or with the expectation ahead of time. And that's sort of where what I'm getting from this, to like let the poetry give the method, and then discover what it's giving to you, to take a back seat rather than controlling the information and putting it into categories you bring with you.
Yeah, make people curious.
Make people curious, leave it a little bit open, and really see what's going on in that object that one can maybe even say, you know, I have this object, it has these words, let's imagine how it might have been used, and then think about what information one has. Like I'm writing fiction right now, and I footnote every single thing I have that's information, but you know, it takes place in the 13th century. Most of it's fiction, and in fact, most of what we know is fiction too, because it's his autobiography, you know, rewritten later for a queen. But anyway, so what does it mean to know? And I think one could really do that with museum objects, retaining the things we know, but also imagining beyond them and indicating, okay, if it's written in pink, it's imaginary, and if it's written in green, it's information. Yeah, one could play with that.
It could also be, and then I open, it could also be one line of thinking about it, because, I mean, there are many ways you can talk about objects, and you could give people the option to choose this approach or this approach, and so everyone, after their own mind, could go over this line or this line.
Or come back to the museum, imagine that.
Or come back, exactly, come back and learn something new.
Or the objects could be in different stories, because in real life, objects reappear in different stories, right, because we live.
Yeah.
So what if instead of having a historical or a geographical line through a museum, one followed a group of objects intersecting through one set of stories, and then had a different set of stories, like,
museum work is fun. There are many things.
Theoretically, it could be super fun because you have so many...
Also in practice.
I mean, if you thought of each object as a word, then imagine all the poetry one could make from it.
And for the poetry, and then is there a hand rising? No? Okay, then I just continue talking. Okay, perfect. Then I have two questions. For the poetry, when we had a special exhibition on Ottoman textiles, there was one poem included, and I could also always see people coming back through to this poem and really engaging with it, reading the German one, the German translation,
Nice.
the Turkish original, and so on. So I can see your approach even in real life exhibition, because people were drawn to it. People would come to this poem and try to figure out what does it have to do with the exhibition, and what do I feel there or sense there that I can see in the objects.
I think also with poetry, I'm just going to say one thing in relation to that. There are a lot of romantic ideas we have of what poetry is, which tend to be limiting, like you used the idea of emotion. And poetry does a lot more than emotion. I mean, it does, of course, affect people. It has an affective aspect, but as you said, it affects memory, right? It engages memory, it engages the brain differently. And I think much as one has contemporary artists working with historic art in the museum setting, one could also invite people to work between languages, with language, with poetry. That is, one could have a much broader discursive spectrum that could take place in the museum. That is one of the things that I think one needs to shift away from, is the implicit idea, of course in an ethnographic museum especially, of we're over here and they're over there, and people of that background will be interested in their own things. It becomes so provincial that everybody should stay in their own lane. And I also feel like that historically. Like, I play with this poetry because Jami was playing with Rumi's poetry. If they can play, why can't I play? Like, I'm making them alive by continuing to play with them because I'm participating in their living tradition. And I think museums can do that, and they can do that transculturally as well. And then you don't have so much of a, us now, them then. Everything doesn't have to stay authentic. I think there should be a marker, like, that's how it was. But the second I'm translating it anyway, bye. But yeah.
Yeah, so I have the microphone. Thank you, Anahita, and thank you, Wendy, for this really wonderful talk. And I think, to me also, as you said at the beginning, this way of performing the talk was really, it made you look at these objects very differently and see them very differently, and it's a totally different engagement. What I wonder, though, as also you answer Anahita's questions, it's also, of course, one way, it's another way of presenting meaning and placing the objects in a story and in a narrative. And how is it better? Yeah.
I don't think it's better. I think that we are used to having one paradigm. And I think it's fine to have multiple paradigms. I think that the idea that academic speech is inherently transparent is, it's just a form. It is a cup. One can have a different cup. And that doesn't, it's not that it's better, it's that it's more that the form of a reasoned argument has become our standard, very mechanical form. And actually, when I wrote Loving Writing, it was because I was teaching my students to do that. And then I was thinking a lot about, why do we do it this way? What alternatives are there? How have certain alternatives fallen away? Why does it count when you write academic essays, but you don't write poetry, but doesn't count when you write poetry? Why do we have these formal distinctions and hierarchies of modes of expression? And especially, the experience of the last few years of my position ending. I was very ill and almost died. I am now like a free agent. I can do whatever I want. It's kind of great. But it's a very weird thing of being in a foreign country but having no affiliation. It's floating. And it really sort of makes you think about what's habitual, what's necessary. And I guess with that, I would also say that, of course, people disagree with me about this, but when I observe how political discourse is functioning in our era, the right is much better at affecting people poetically and recognizing and speaking to their emotional and subjective desires, whereas the sort of middle of the road, I'm not even going to call them left, are like, look at the charts, the economy is good. Like, it doesn't, here's the information, here we have the statistics. Like, you've got to make those statistics talk to people. You know, and I feel like there's a enormous communication failure by the people who have information and have knowledge to get it to people in ways they can understand. And Ibn Muqaffa has a phrase in one of the many multiple introductions to Kalila wa Dimna, when he says, some people will take these fables as entertainment, but the wise will understand what they really are. And, you know, that is something to learn from. I want to know how to make these things that I think are important, you know, understandable. And part of that for me is sort of, how do we move away from the frameworks of capitalism into producing other kinds of meaning? You know, is a museum just about its fungibility? Is it only about who owns the object? How did they get here? Who are we giving them back to? It's not that I'm against that. It's that if you give the objects back, they're going to end up in another museum, maybe. Or they're going to be on the market, maybe. They don't go back in time. They don't go back in meaning. You know, so it's just reproducing the same system with a different owner. So I'm just thinking about, like, what kinds of systems of meanings can we produce, and how do we do that? And yeah, but I don't know if it's better. I just think it's different.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was a provocative question.
I've thought about this.
It's fantastic that you, you really answered it. A follow-up question would be, is it important for us to understand how we've come to the meanings that we've, you know, reproduced over and over again, or is it not necessary for...
Oh, I love historiography. I just don't want to get stuck in it. Yeah, I mean, you know, I love historiography. That was the main thing that I got into because it's so interesting and so weird. And it undoes, I mean, the thing that's really fun about historiography is that it undoes the purity of information, right? Because suddenly we have real people making real mistakes, having affairs, jumping countries, like, you know, it gets to be amusing. But doing the historiography doesn't, if we're going to try to engage with a culture that we don't already know, historiography doesn't do that. Historiography features how we got the stuff, or it features like the things that, how it's gotten transmitted to us. But I actually want to shake hands with the other and live Levinas's sense. And though I know I can't fully, I can learn from their alterity, and there's something extraordinarily liberating in that. You know, so I'm not against it. It's that I think and also. Of course there should be history, of course there should be historiography, but there's also, how is that passage going to speak to me? And how can I understand a world in which that passage is part of how people interact? Or how can I imagine a world, like if we think of a king, for example, the reason I did that funny thing with the black paper, right? We have these kings, and king after king is seated with a rose in his hand or with wine in his glass. When we picture a king, we're thinking of a person with a scepter and a crown on a throne. We are not thinking of a dude on a pillow with a glass of wine. It means something to have a king who's sniffing a rose. Like, it means something. Because you imagine power differently. And that tells me, it's not that the kings weren't vicious. I mean, there's a wonderful manuscript painting down the hall with like a tower of heads. But it means the idea of power is something different, and that's worth thinking about. Trump isn't walking around with a rose. But yeah, so I mean, it's not either or, it's and, definitely and. And I mean, I think with exhibits, for example, one could do different exhibits. You know, it doesn't, like I was saying to Anahita, there's a Historisches Museum in Bern, and they have objects that were collected in the late 19th and early 20th century from Central Asia. And when the tour guide was taking people around, she was like, Islam emerged in the desert of the Najab in the 7th century. And she went around telling the history of Islamic art based on Central Asian objects collected in the 19th century. And I was like, why? Like, why always tell the same story? Or here, 5 pillars of Islam, Sunni and Shiite. Like, how are people supposed to read that on the wall and then see a bowl and know what to think about? Like, no idea.
The problem, though, is which kind of cultural knowledge is necessary then, for meaning to be fully understood by the person who's looking at it.
I mean, this is true also for European painting. If you look at European medieval painting, most people don't know the stories of the saints. So, I mean, I think the big problem is a museum is a technology of the 19th century. And there's a reason that many of the people who go to museums are older, because museums aren't providing that meta information that makes it exciting or makes it interesting. And so, to me, the question one has is, how do you bring in song? How do you bring in myth? When you talk about a myth, tell the story. When you're talking about jinn, tell the story. Don't just mention the story. Don't assume people are going to look it up. Tell the story. Get an animation and tell the story. But I mean, sometimes for me, the bigger problem is this. One of my pet peeves is that whenever people talk about the Conference of the Birds, they go with look, there are 30 birds. Then they see their reflection and they realize that the sea morgue is themselves. It's a story about collective action. And if you read the poem, no, they burn up in the theophany of becoming one as the divine. It's a very different story. And the thing is, talking about religion is very difficult in our society. And so the danger of actually telling these stories is getting pushback from contemporary, often more conservative religious actors. So that's, I think, where we really have a danger, is which stories are allowed to be told by whom, and how does the museum maintain its neutrality without threatening those boundaries. And that's, I think, where one gets into even more complicated questions. And I don't have great answers for that. I just think it's interesting how certain types of censorship are built into the production of meaning that's both neutral and also less fascinating.
I take the micro until I bring it to you. What I really admire about your work is not that you say this is how you should do it, but you open a door, you show a path, you show this is also how you could do it. And I think this is actually something that the world of Islamic art, of the museums, are interested in, or at least what I'm interested in, because when I look at the tombstone of every object, so I mean, if you go to the museum, you see an object and you have the little description, and then you see exactly when was it made, blah, 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 blah. And it was some years ago, and I was discussing with colleagues if we should include the inventory number. And it was, I mean, the inventory number for us is important because then we know which object is which. And it was a big discussion. It was not in the museum, but with other colleagues from the Islamic art world. And it was actually a big discussion. What should we do? Should we include it or not? For whom do we do these descriptions? And the ordinary visitors, they are not interested in the number of the object. This is only something you would do for other colleagues. And sometimes I have the feeling we write these texts for other colleagues as well, and that's not how it is, right? You write it for the audience to inform themselves. And I like your way of just looking from a different angle. What could we also do? I mean, it's not what we have to do, but it's also a way of looking at things. And you're looking impatient. I give it to you now.
I'm not looking impatient. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. Thank you. It was very impressive, also as a didactic experiment, and it interests me as such. I don't even know where to start to ask. One question would be if you could expand a little more on this idea of the formlessness giving shape to the form. I haven't quite understood that.
It's a tricky one, and it would help if I found the exact quotation, because I can't quote it properly. But I think that the way in which, let's stick with this one. We have the cups, and these are the forms. And if you get stuck on the forms, like this, for me in this case, this conversation, the forms are the tombstone. The forms are the dynasty, the date, the material, the general information with which we consider our knowledge to be complete. But that completion of knowledge becomes the goal in itself. Then you get frozen in the goal of, I have all the proper information. So to give another example, many of the paintings that we have aren't unique or masterpieces because they follow particular formal rules. And often the paintings don't have signatures. So the most famous painter is considered Bisad because his paintings have signatures. That doesn't mean he was the most famous or the most important at the time. It's because his paintings have something that we want because we're used to that as one of the things on the tombstone. That doesn't make his they're really great paintings, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't make them uniquely great. So this issue of forms in this case, as I'm understanding it, is don't get stuck on the things you expect to see. Let the things that are there, that don't have a form in your mind yet, let them produce their own arena of play, because then they will create their own forms. So if you don't have a signature, fine. You let it be a collective act that people in this culture were interacting with each other, and then you start thinking about what does it mean to have an artist who isn't an individual, but is a collective practice interacting with a poetic framework. And then you start getting into sort of different questions of what kinds of forms are emerging from the work. So here what I was trying to ask was, if I don't start with the museum, or let me go back. When I did my book on what is Islamic art, the question I had was, if I had these things and I wasn't already thinking art history, how would I give them meaning before art history in an Islamic context? And so I had to ask myself, okay, what's art? Things that are made. Okay, things that are not made by God, but actually a lot of these poems, God is the maker. So I had to rethink how I was thinking about the object and thinking about perception. I really got pulled into perception because it's how you take in the object. And so my question became, without having these categories, how would I take things in? And how do I get to know that? And I was sort of like, okay, people would read the Quran. There's a lot of poetry that refers to the Quran, and there's poetry refers to each other, so I have a discursive field. So my question became, within this discursive field, how are things I would think about as art coming in? So for this talk, my question was a tiny bit different. It was, in this discursive field, what's an exhibit? And what an exhibit is, as I understand it from these poems which are moving between each other, it's a temporary collective that comes together to produce meaning, and then it dissolves. It's always temporary. It's always in the moment of slipping from one thing to the next, or from one poem to the next, or, as in a museum, from one object to the next. And then the objects don't have to be physical objects. They might be different kinds of objects. They might be music. They might be poetry. Because in the real world, we're not like bowl, 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 bowl. We're like bowl, soup spoon, glass, fork, knife. Like we have multiple things next to each other. So by form, I don't mean get rid of the object. I mean get rid of the expectations of what that object's going to do, the expectations of what the categories that fill the object with meaning are. And then think about, how does that object circulate, not just physically in the world through trade and so on, But how do people inhabit it? That sort of is my question, because to me, if we're going to understand culture, knowing that something was made under the dynasty of such and such a ruler doesn't give me culture. It doesn't give me that, it doesn't get me closer. It just says time period. Or a location doesn't get me closer. So I'm trying to find something about what's that encounter. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does help me. I'm just wondering, because I'm teaching teenagers, and I wonder how much expertise is needed in order to take such a free approach to transmitting knowledge. Don't you have to be a very experienced scholar in order to take it a step further and move to poetry? I've always had a dissatisfaction with Islamic art history because it was never giving me what I wanted. And then when I turned 40, I had a child, I was in a foreign country, I couldn't do research, my job was abusive, I had to change countries. And I was like, what can I do so that I can get a job somewhere else? And I had all these restrictions. And I was like, I can try to answer the question that I'm not trained for, but I always wanted to know. And I gave myself permission to do it. And there's a long story for how that happened. So yes, and I think one of the things that people who are experts can do is to produce more material that can be accessible for people who are using it. So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm making illustrated books out of some of the stories that I've used that have multiple media that are interacting with each other so that one can discuss these ideas. So I'm just starting a series of this. And my hope is other people will do stuff too, because, I don't want to be the only one. I don't have the perfect answer. But I feel like just like somebody who's teaching is using the knowledge as brought together by others, that's been done in this very academic way with particular kinds of knowledge, one needs other kinds of work also that can bring it together in a more poetic form. So I'm trying to do that, and other people will do it differently, and that would be great. But yeah, it does take a certain amount of, it's been a long time. Like I started writing this book, I think in 2013. So yeah, it's been a while. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and what it comes back through is the story, right? You don't have to do it in poetry, but I think what you're doing and what we in guided tours or as museum try as well is to tell the story, to tell people what is it about, what you're seeing, who are these people, why are there skulls in this. So if you go to the exhibition, you will see. Just to try to explain and to engage, and why do we have the dynasties, Ottoman, Qajar, whatever? Because experts know what to do with this, and when you see, oh, this bowl is from the Qajar area, then you, as someone who is trained to know what that means, you get a meaning. But people who are visiting our exhibitions, normally what should they do if they can read Safavid? Great. So I see your point, and I think as museums we have to think about different ways how to draw people in and how to bring also the stories to life behind.
I would add that also, like experts also they're about categories, but ultimately I think they're market categories. It's an Ottoman manuscript painting that's being put for sale at an auction. Like, I think those categories gain a lot of market meanings. Yeah. It's a metalwork, it's paper, it's, I think a lot of the ways in which we construct categories are about categories of connoisseurship as, through the 19th century legacies of collecting. And so, when I'm saying I'm trying to think about meaning outside of the frameworks of collecting, that's why I'm going to this poetry. And one can also say that there's this poem that I love that's really funny, that's by a ney player, a flute player in 20th century Turkey. And he's like, what's this crap on the radio that they're forcing us to listen to? Because in Turkey they were forcing them to listen to really bad bands and orchestras. And, there's a going on. So I'm trying to think about, like, how do you make meaning without these commercial meanings that come in and these categorical meanings. And I don't necessarily have the answers, but questions, yeah.
And I think,
I have one more question.
Yes. If it's about creating different perspectives around one object, who would be the people capable and cultivated enough and somehow responsible enough to create the more poetic approaches towards these objects? Who could the people be?
I mean, I think that anytime one has knowledge transfer, there's a collective building up of knowledge, right? And so I got all of these poems. I purposefully worked with poems that have been translated into Western languages because they are all available, right? There are lots of poetry which isn't, but there's a lot that is. And partially that was convenient for me. Right? My other languages, I know Turkish very well, but not other languages. But really it's about that expertise develops, the more people do it. So that when people were writing, even 30 years ago, even when I was in grad school, the materials available were much less rich than the things that doctoral students are writing now, and partially that's because of the internet. So over time, if people develop methods, that practice will grow. But you don't get there in 1 minute. What one can always do is, for example, if one's working with a single work, like a single painting, that's usually the easiest, one can go to the translations of the poetry and read the poetry. And that was really, I mean, it sounds silly, but Islamic art historians don't sit around reading poetry. So when I started really reading this poetry, the paintings became much more meaningful to me. And I was kind of astounded that nobody had been doing that. And I was also astounded that people haven't been, say, looking through Attar and finding all the quotations of the Quran and of other poetry that's within it. And there were things I found that I was like, I cannot be the person finding this. I don't have the expertise for this. And yet I was seeing connections that I'm pretty sure are there. And I haven't found where experts on it have written about it because they don't write about it interpretively. And that's super frustrating. And, do I have the expertise to do that? No, but nobody else is. So what am I supposed to do? But I think that's about how we categorize knowledge, what kind of risks we allow ourselves to take. Is it okay to interpret somebody else's poetry? And, is it better if I interpret Shakespeare, but I can't interpret Rumi? Why? Is Shakespeare any more mine than Rumi is? Not really. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer, except that if people don't do it, then you don't go anywhere. You have to do it wrong for a while till people eventually figure it out. And yeah.
To conclude, many ways guide into the wine, the cup. If I don't see more questions, then do I? No?
I don't have a question. I just want to give a feedback because Sorry, I'm feeling overwhelmed too, and I just would like to give you a feedback. I think, or I want to thank you for encouraging to be courageous, to approach the artifacts in a many-layered or many-faceted way, and it was stunning how you presented it. I feel really flattered, and thank you for the eye-opening lecture. And I think it is about stories, but it is also about voices. And I thank you as an institution also to open the field or the institution for a many-faceted way of telling stories. And I find it extremely important that we keep on going, opening our way of approaching talking about artifacts and inviting not only amazing people like you, but also being interested in our audience. And I think especially working with younger people and teenagers, approaching and encouraging the younger generation to be courageous, to talk in different ways, and to be courageous to use other fields like music or poetry in order to get close to the essence of these artifacts in a better way. Thank you so much.
That was very, very kind of you. Thank you. I just want to say one little thing, which is that we have these rules that you're supposed to follow in order to be successful, and I don't know that they get you anywhere. And so I know those rules really well. I used them for a long time. I've learned a lot from them. So I'm not anti-rules, but I'm also about rules are stepping stones. They are ladders. They're very important to learn so that you can learn to fly from them. And I think that people think that by following the rules, they'll, climb the ladder. And the ladder is something to learn from, but it's not necessarily the only thing. It's not the destination. And, I'll just stop with that. But, so I sort of feel like one of the things that happens is people are more open to being creative with certain kinds of things that they say, oh, this is my culture. And I'm like, 15th century anything is not my culture. So I can learn from it. I can just engage with it. Why not? Who's stopping me? Who's stopping me became a really important thing for me to think about over time. And I'll just stop with that.
Und hier schließt sich der Kreis, die Schnittstelle zwischen Philosophie und islamischer Kunst.
Immer.
Vielen, vielen herzlichen Dank. Thank you very
Danke
much,
dir.
Wendy. It was super interesting. I think we
And
were
thank you all for coming.
mesmerized. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
Super, super nice. Super interesting.
Great.
No, I
I'm
really
glad.
want to hear poetry.
I'm glad.